Well, hello again. My name's Adrian Gilbert, and I'd like to welcome you back to our investigation into the amazing book of Revelation, the Apocalypse of St. John. Now, we're up to chapter 6, and we've already covered the first 4 of the seals. Remember, there's this sealed book which nobody could open until the Lamb, which is code for Jesus Christ, would come along, and he would have the authority to open the seals. The first 4 seals concern the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So we're now coming to the 5th seal, which concerns the souls of the martyrs. So without more ado, let's press on and see what it says here about that. Now, so he opens the 5th seal. And when he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. They cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before thou wilt judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell upon the earth? So this is fairly clear, isn't it? We've got a situation where souls of the martyrs, those who've been beheaded or crucified or thrown to the lions or whatever, are quite rightfully saying, how long have we got to wait before you're going to give us vengeance for what's been done to us in your name? That's kind of how you would be towards a king or a senior politician who had said, look, believe in me and we're going to sort everything out, and you're my heroes and we're going to make things right. And then for some reason they're killed and murdered by the evil ones, and they have a justifiable complaint to make about what's going on. And you might think, well, that's kind of it. But there's actually a lot more to this than meets the eye. So without more ado, let's have a look at what this whole idea of beneath the altar is really talking about, because it is important. Now, in the Catholic Church, altars are usually made from a single slab of stone. It was, until recently, a requirement that a holy relic of a saint be placed in a niche inside and underneath the stone. Most often, but not always, these were relics of martyrs, which is to say witnesses. There's one word there, the word martyr in the Greek, it actually does mean a witness. So there's someone who's witnessing Jesus Christ and to the point of death. Amazing thing to do. I mean, well, it'd be a lot easier, really, to just go along with them and say, look, doesn't mean that much to me. Forget it. I'm not bearing witness to this guy. And probably they'd spare your life. But if you're going to push the point, well, they take you out and crucify you, throw you to the lions. And this was the reality in the early Christian church, certainly at the time of Nero. So we can see this idea about the altar stone and martyr's bones underneath it. Well, maybe that's kind of a token to do with that. But let's examine this a bit further. The saint whose relic is placed under the altar is, or was, usually the patron saint of the church in question. In Wales, and maybe elsewhere in the British Isles, it was customary for churches to be founded by particularly holy and learned saints. These churches were therefore named after the saint in question, and his body was buried there. Later on, other saints and dignitaries would likely be buried in the church too. The nearer the tomb and effigy was to the altar, the better, for the belief was that on the last day the dead would rise out of their tombs, and it would then be advantageous to be close to the patron saint, and therefore under his protection. So we have this idea that each church is under the protection of a patron saint. That's what a patron saint means. But there's more to it than that, and I'll tell you a little story that happened some years ago. I had a friend who was extremely psychic. This is an American lady, and she came to stay with us here in England. And she was someone who could actually see the spirits of the dead. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen that series on television, Ghost Whisperer. I used to like watching that years ago, where this very psychic clairvoyant could see the souls or the people who had died, and they would come along, they would talk to her, and she would find out why they were not able to go to the light, as she put it, what was keeping them earthbound, and help them sort out their problems. Well, this lady had a similar kind of facility, that she could see spirits and she could talk to them. And I remember she came back, she'd been up to London on a tour of Westminster Abbey. She came back and said, well, she'd been having a chat with all these kings and queens, people like Queen Elizabeth I. Come on, don't be stupid. Yeah, they're buried there, but come on. Well, a little while later, we went up to London together, a couple of days later, and I took her to see Southwark Cathedral, which is a small cathedral near London Bridge, so it's a church. And I didn't tell her anything about this place, Southwark Cathedral, so she didn't know anything about it. And we were walking around, and she said to me, why are there all these nuns everywhere? All these women, you know? And I hadn't told her this, and she didn't know it, but Southwark Cathedral had one time been a nunnery. Yeah, before the Reformation, it had been a nunnery, and the church, the monastic part of the buildings, I guess, had probably been knocked down. The church had been preserved, which happened quite a lot, and become a parish church, and then it had been elevated to a cathedral, which it is now. And you wouldn't know, there's nothing in there to show you the earlier history of it, unless you really investigate. But she had picked up on that. And then a few days later, we went down to Canterbury Cathedral. And again, she'd never been to Canterbury. She didn't know anything about the history of Canterbury. So it is actually it is the oldest cathedral of the Anglican Church, which is to say the English Church, because St. Augustine came over and converted the King of Kent, the English King of Kent, sometime in I think it's the 7th century, maybe the 6th, Ethelbert. And he converted him to Catholicism, and so that became the first church of the English Church. Now, I say English because there had, of course, been a British church before the Anglo-Saxon conquest of England, which happened after the Romans left. So that sort of, the Anglo-Saxons started coming, I think, 448 AD, and bit by bit, what is now England was conquered and became England, whereas before it had all been part of Britain, and the people who would have lived there, the British, would have spoken a language like Welsh, and they would have been much closer in ethnicity to the Welsh people, where a lot of the customs and traditions of the old British church have been preserved. Sorry if this sounds a little bit complicated, but the English, when they first arrived, the Anglo-Saxons were pagans. So they were converted, but they weren't converted by the native British, they were converted by people sent by the Pope in Rome, St. Augustine in particular, and they were converted to Roman Catholicism. So she didn't know any of this history, she didn't know about Canterbury Cathedral. But we walked around a bit, and they said, I just want to go off and explore a bit. So then she came back later, and she said to me, Adrian, she said, who is this Anselmus who's been showing me round? Now, Anselmus is an old former Archbishop of Canterbury in Norman times, right? So 1,000 years ago almost. And he had been showing her around, his spirit had been showing her around. So this idea, it seems very, very weird that you could go to a church and you could meet people in there, the spirits who lived there, as it were. But it's actually not. This is actually a much more ancient thing than we might imagine. So there's more to it than this. The presence of a holy relic of a saint is believed to act as a sort of communication device that links the saint with the earthly world. It was understood that the souls of the patron saint would live at least for part of the time in his church. So you get this idea that if you have a church of St. Edmund, now I went to a school called St. Edmund's, and we actually had a major relic of St. Edmund, a fibula from his leg, was kept in a ruby glass tube, and that was actually above the altar in the shrine chapel, as it was called. And that was taken out once a year and paraded round the school grounds with lots of singing and hymns and etc. As the patron saint of the school. But the idea would be that if you had a patron saint's relic, that would act like a kind of calling device that you could summon isn't the right word, but you could connect with him somehow through his bone. If you hadn't got a bone, perhaps a ring or some piece of clothing or something that had their vibration to it, and you could connect, and then you could direct your prayers. And the idea was that it wasn't the saint himself who did the healing or the sorting out the problem that you wanted sorted out or whatever. That was going to be done by God. But because this guy was closer to God, he could act to speak up on your behalf as your advocate. So this was the idea within the Catholic, it still is in the Catholic Church. I think it probably was in most other churches, Greek Orthodox, whatever, that you could go to the tomb of the martyr or the saint and ask him to intercede on your behalf. That was the idea. And the church in which his tomb is contained would be the church that he was patron of, where his spirit would spend some of its time there, and you could go and you could talk to him. That's the idea behind it. And that was the same with the idea of pilgrimage. But I'll come to that in a minute. But this is similar to a belief in Egypt that the ka, or vital soul of a deceased person, could return to their tomb. Their surviving relatives and friends would then visit the tomb to make offerings of flowers, wine, food, or whatever, for the ka of the deceased to feed upon. At the same time, they would ask them for favours from the next world. It is the same in the Catholic Church, at least it was in the Middle Ages. A supplicant who wants his or her intercession would go to the church in question to tell the saint what they wanted and ask them to act as their advocate with God. Some saints, such as St. Edward the Confessor, were rumoured to have healing powers. Thus sick people would visit the tomb and maybe spend the night there, praying and asking for healing from whatever ailment they were suffering from. So I want you to understand this, that we have this, we tend to think about Christianity in purely the context of Jesus of Nazareth, who's born the son of a carpenter, but he's God as well. So he has this inspiration. He sets out and he does his miracles. Crucified, dead, rises again from the dead, and he's going to come back at the end of time and rescue the world. That's basically the teaching. But it's not really like that. He didn't come out of nothing. He came out of traditions which were ancient, even before his own time, even before the time of the Jews. You've got to understand the Jews themselves, or the Israelites, I should say, and that those two terms should not be confused, by the way. They're a relatively recent phenomenon. You go back to Abraham, we're only talking about probably around 1800 BC. What happened before then? You know, that is a relatively recent process of salvation, let's call it that. But there have been other things going on before then, and other attempts, perhaps, at rescue mission to Earth from heaven, preparatory, perhaps, towards this big one. But nevertheless, there's still the imprints left in our cultures around the world of other intercessions. And in Egypt, they particularly had the Osiris religion. And if you study the Osiris religion, you find that it has a lot that's very similar to Christianity. And in fact, there was a time, I think the early church fathers, understanding this, they said, well, it was started by the devil, and the devil was plagiarizing Christianity in advance. In other words, he knew what was coming, so he set up a fake version in advance, plagiarism in anticipation. Well, that's a very odd idea, isn't it, when you think about it? But what we can understand, perhaps, is that this was an earlier rescue mission, and so that when Jesus comes along, when Abraham comes along, that they can learn things from what happened previously. And there's other ones too, like Zoroaster, Krishna in India. You know, there's clear evidence of other intercessions, let's say, from above on this planet. And so there could be the remnants of some of what people understood, such as that souls live on and can be contacted. And if they're high souls, people who are highly developed, like saints, that you could ask them to intercede for you. And that you might even have, like the Chinese do, they have a whole kind of culture or cult of the ancestors, where they have a little shrine in their house where, you know, the ancestors live, or at least they can be contacted through the ancestral shrine, because they still are patrons of their family. An odd idea, perhaps, but you can understand the significance of it. And don't we all, if we've got relatives that we knew and we loved who died, we go to their graveside to put flowers there and have a chat with them, maybe? It's not such a peculiar idea when you look at it this way. So I mentioned Westminster Abbey. It's a very strange, odd building, and not so much in how it looks, but in what it signifies. It's what's called a royal peculiar, which means it's not the seat of a bishop. It's actually not under the authority of a bishop. It's a collegiate church, which is directly under the monarch. In other words, the Queen owns this church. She certainly is in charge of it. And here, nearly all the kings and queens of England and Great Britain have been crowned, and many of them are buried there as well. I mentioned about this lady I took who went up to Westminster Abbey, and she'd have a chat with various kings and queens in there, that somehow there's a kind of royal sanctuary. And maybe that's another reason why it's kind of revered. It's a special place for us. And there are also many other burials of notable British politicians, scientists, poets and others. and to be buried here is considered a great honour. Well, you've heard of Poets' Corner. I mean, these days there's not enough room, I guess, underneath to put all the bodies into the crypt, but they will have plaques on the wall in Poets' Corner of notable people. There is actually the tomb of Sir Isaac Newton in there. Not sure if his body's actually in there, but there is a tomb there. Um, he's probably our greatest ever scientist. And there are other notable people like prime ministers and so on who've been buried there. Interestingly, Oliver Cromwell was buried there for a short time, but after the Restoration, Charles II, his body was taken out because he was the one that had Charles I executed. When Charles I's son came back, Charles II, was restored to his throne, one of the first things they did was to take out Cromwell's body and hang it out on the gallows at Tyburn, and it was left there to rot. And his skull, somehow someone collected his skull and it was hidden up a chimney. So very odd things that happen in British history when you dig into it. Anyway, so he didn't stay there. But Westminster Abbey was founded by Edward the Confessor. Inside the Abbey church is his tomb. Edward was a healer when he was alive and was regarded as a living saint. And his casket was opened in 1098. He died in 1096. Inside, his body was found to be uncorrupted, and this was regarded as a miracle. A shrine was built for him in the Middle Ages. Pilgrims would flock to it. And it's the only such shrine to survive the English Reformation, although it was damaged and was afterwards restored by Mary I. Yeah, you've got to understand that in the Middle Ages, England, like everywhere else in Europe, had shrines of the saints. So you could go down to Canterbury Cathedral, I just mentioned, where Thomas à Becket was murdered, and where a big shrine was constructed for him, and huge numbers of pilgrims would go down there to visit his shrine to get healing and help from the saint. You know, the Canterbury Tales you've probably read or maybe heard of by Chaucer documents in a very humorous fashion stories of people on their way to Canterbury, and they're telling each other stories as they're travelling along. Glastonbury Abbey was another big centre of pilgrimage because they had a shrine of King Arthur. Bones had been dug up, and these were believed to be the bones of King Arthur and Guinevere, and a big shrine was built, and people would go along there. Now that shrine actually was taken out and destroyed on the orders of Henry VIII, who was himself half Welsh, and he knew very well that this was actually a phony, fake shrine. These were not the bones of King Arthur, and he ordered that shrine be destroyed. So there's nothing there now. It says there is a mark on the ground in front of the altar where it would have stood, or where the altar would have stood as well. But you can go there and you can see that in the ruins of Glastonbury Abbey. And there are other shrines all over the place where people would go to pray to various saints. So inside the Abbey church is his tomb. Yeah, it's the only such chance to survive. Right. In 1066, William the Conqueror had himself crowned in front of Edward's tomb, so that the saint would bear witness to his legitimacy. Since then, nearly all coronations of English kings and queens have taken place in front of Edward's shrine. Now, this is a very interesting thing. I mean, even our present queen, she was crowned. They have to sit on the special throne as a special chair, which was constructed on the orders of King Edward I, who's not the same as this Edward the Confessor, by the way. Edward I brought the Stone of Scone, or the Stone of Destiny as it's known, from Scotland. He'd gone up there, he'd taken it from Scone Abbey in Scotland, and he had this special throne constructed to slot this stone in underneath it. This stone is Jacob's pillow stone. I'm going to talk about that later. But the coronation is also done in front of Edward's tomb. And I think the idea behind this is that the confessor himself bears witness to the legitimacy of the coronation of the king or queen. And the reason for that is very simple. When William I, Norman king, conquered England in 1066, he defeated Harold, got an arrow in his eye in the Battle of Hastings, and he went on to get himself crowned. And William had earlier met Edward the Confessor, who was shipwrecked in Normandy, and William had got Edward to swear an oath on a Bible. But the story goes that Edward didn't know the Bible was hidden under a cloth, and he had his hand on it, that William would be his successor. So this is, I think, what the confession of Edward is. He confesses, which means that he acknowledges and accepts as truth that William I should be his successor. So the Normans wanted to make clear to everyone, look, we're being crowned here because Edward the Confessor is in his tomb there. He said that William, the first king of this new dynasty, should be the king. In actuality, William had no blood right to the throne at all. He got it by conquest. One of his sons, Henry I, I'm digressing here a bit, but never mind, it's fun. Henry I married a daughter of the Queen Margaret of Scotland, who was herself descended from the Anglo-Saxon lineage of Edward the Confessor's older half-brother. Right, so I won't go further into that, but anyway, so that they reconnected back into the bloodline of the English that way, through the Scots. Anyway, so that's a digression there. So nearly all the kings and queens of England are crowned in front of their. There's only been one or two that weren't. I think King John was one, but there were perhaps one or two others. Now, this we might think is enough. The idea of the martyrs being under the throne, under the altar, could signify what's being talked about here. But there is something much more direct and personal, which I think is what is really being talked about here by St. John in the Apocalypse. And to understand this, we need to look at another church, and this one is in Rome. And it's called the Church of St. Praxedes, or in Italian they call it St. Prasseda, or Santa Prasseda. And it's on the Esquiline Hill in Rome. It's a little bit out from the centre. And you don't hear it talked about very much, but it is actually a magnificent church. And if you're ever in Rome, I really recommend a visit there, because it's covered in Byzantine mosaics on the walls, telling various stories. I mean, it is beautiful to look at. But that's not why we're talking about it here. One of the oldest churches in Rome, and beneath it are catacombs containing the remains of thousands of martyrs and even 13 popes. So the church stands on the site of the Palatium Britannicum, where lived King Caractacus and his family after he was captured and sent back to Rome. Let me just say a few words about that. The Romans under Claudius invaded Britain in 43 AD, and they conquered the southeast of England very quickly. It's fairly flat land, good for putting out your legions, and the Britons in that area were a bit disunited, and they were conquered fairly easily. Well, then the Romans moved on westwards and northwards, and they pressed on towards Wales, and then they ran up against the tribe of people called the Silures. The Silures lived in what is Siluria, which was South Wales, and part of that western part of England, what would now be Gloucestershire. And the king there was called Caractacus or Caradoc. And he fought a long campaign against the Romans, which lasted for 9 years. It was a sort of guerrilla campaign, guerrilla commander. Um, and he won many battles against them. But eventually he was betrayed. He was defeated in battle and betrayed by the Queen of Northumbria, or what's now Northumbria at the time, a woman called Cartis Mandua. And he was betrayed and handed over to the Romans, along with his entire family. And he was taken back to Rome, a prisoner, and he could expect to be executed. I mean, he was the Romans always did this. So if they captured a war leader that they had fought a war against, they'd bring them back for a triumphal parade through Rome, where the general who had carried out this amazing task of defeating this person and capturing this territory, the people would come out and they'd wave and scream and acknowledge his enormous achievements, and the captives would be paraded along behind his chariot as he went through, and then eventually the king or whoever it was that he defeated would be ceremonially throttled and his body thrown in the Tiber. I mean, that was what Caractacus could expect. But somehow it didn't work out that way. He must have spoken Latin, I think, or maybe it was Greek, but he certainly spoke something they could understand. And he was taken and he stood in the Senate. I suppose the Senate had to pass judgment. But he made an impassioned speech to the Senate where Claudius was sitting with his wife. And he said, look, you know, I'm a great king over many nations, meaning different tribes in Britain. And you expected me to just surrender? I couldn't do that, could I? Now you have me in your power and you can execute me and it'll soon be forgotten. However, if you pardon me, then your act of mercy will be remembered forever. He must have put it better than I have just there. But it's recorded in Tacitus, who's one of the great Roman historians. This whole speech is recorded there, so we know it's true. And Claudius must have liked this. It must have maybe he was just tickled by it, or the effrontery of it, or I don't know what exactly. But anyway, he did decide to pardon him on two conditions. First of all, he would never bear weapons against Rome again. And secondly, that he would have to live there in Rome, I think for at least 7 years with his family. So the place they went to live at was in the Esquiline Hill, which was known as the Palatium Britannicum, the Palace of the British. Now this is going to have huge consequences for the future. Go back to here. The church stands on the site of the Palatium Britannicum, where lived King Caractacus and his family after they were captured and sent back to Rome. One of his sons was Saint Linus, who's the first Gentile bishop of Rome. You have to understand that although St. Peter's recognized as the first bishop of Rome, he was a bishop of the Jewish church in Rome. There was also a Gentile church in Rome, and St. Linus was the first bishop of that. A daughter, called Gladys, Claudia, married a Roman senator, Rufus Pudens. Just stop there a second. Gladys is a Welsh name, and it's actually is the equivalent of Claudia. Welsh names are quite peculiar, but often if you analyse them carefully, you can find out what the equivalent is in Latin or English or whatever. But Gladys, Gladwith, would be like Claudius. See, it's perhaps a little hard to see, but it is true. So her name was Claudia. Maybe she was named after Claudius. I don't know. Seems quite likely, doesn't it? But anyway, she married Senator Rufus Pudens. Now, Rufus Pudens, there's actually a stone put up in Chichester which has his name on it, where he had founded some little temple. There's a big, huge palace at Fishbourne, in no, is it Fishbourne? I forget now actually, but outside Chichester anyway, where there's a palace of a local king. And so this was obviously a major centre in the early days of the Roman conquest of Britain. And so we know there was Pudens was in Britain, um, which is not so surprising. I mean, the senatorial class in Rome were usually had to serve some time in the military, in one capacity or another, and that's probably where he met Claudia, Gladys, um, either there or in Rome. Anyway, but anyway, they were both became Christians. She may have been already. We don't know exactly. But they were friends of Saint Paul, who mentions them and Linus, and in his second letter to Timothy. Timothy was one of their sons. So there's this whole family connection with Saint Paul in the Bible. And you can see their names there recorded. And they lived in the Pudens house, which is now the Church of Saint Pudentiana, which is really only a few hundred yards away from this Saint Praxide. Pudentiana was Praxide or Praxide's sister, and they were both daughters of this Rufus Pudens and Claudia. So Saint Pudentiana, the church there is the house of Pudens, and underneath that they've excavated and they've found different levels of this Roman villa underneath it. So it's there, you know. And under this church, St. Praxide, there are these catacombs. Let me just press on here. Pudentiana and Praxides were the daughters of Rufus Pudens and Claudia. Their brothers were St. Timothy, who travelled with Paul, and St. Novatus. And during the cruel persecution of Christians by Nero in 64 AD, Pudentiana and Praxides collected the dead bodies of martyrs and buried them in the catacombs beneath the Palatium Britannicum, where the church of St. Praxides is today. Thus, beneath the altar are the remains of thousands of martyrs. St. John knew some of them personally. These would be the martyrs who are told to wait. So you see that this idea of the martyrs waiting underneath the altar, it actually it could well be based on a reality. But if you go there, these bodies are stacked up in the catacombs, and there are actually the tombs there of Pudentiana and Praxides themselves. Now, they don't let people in there normally, and I've only ever seen pictures of these. But when I last went there, there was a big sign at the back of the church written in Italian. I had an Italian friend with me, and he was able to translate it for me, saying how there were X thousand martyrs buried under their saints and 13 popes. And St. Pudentiana Church, which is around the corner, the site of Rufus Pudens' house, is actually recognised as the first cathedral of Rome. Yeah, I mean, you know, the cathedral in Rome is actually not the Vatican, it's the Church of St. John Lateran. But that was not built and made such until the time of Constantine in the 4th century. This church, on the building of Rufus Pudens, was much older. We're talking about the very beginnings of Christianity in Rome. And that's where people like Paul and Peter and so on all used to stay, you know, courtesy of the senator and his family, who were devout Christians. So this idea of the martyrs underneath the altar, well, they are under the altar. The catacomb is under the altar in this church, crying out, you know, how long are we going to have to stay here? You know, when are you going to give us vengeance? What's been done to us? Well, it probably is based on some kind of reality, and it's not unlikely that St. John himself knew these people and knew all about this burying of the martyrs underneath this particular building. Anyway, let's press on. The next thing that we read about is the white robe. The souls are waiting beneath the altar are given a white robe. Then they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and brethren should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been. So here we have this story. There they are. They're under the altar, waiting, and then they're handed out these white robes. But what are these white robes for? Well, if you consult the Gospels, it's very clear that the white robe is clearly the same thing as the wedding garment mentioned in Matthew's Gospel. What's that all about? Well, it goes on in the Matthew Gospel, it says, "But when the king came in to look at the guests, he saw there a man who had no wedding garment. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment?' And he was speechless." That's the guy who's being asked this question. Then the king said to the attendants, "Bind him hand and foot and cast him into the outer darkness. There men will weep and gnash their teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen." And that you'll find that quote in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 22, verse 11 to 14. So we have this thing in the Matthew Gospel where it's telling us that if you haven't got a wedding garment, you can't be in the wedding. What's the wedding? Well, throughout the Gospels, we get the story about the idea of the bridegroom coming for the wedding. And it was the custom, I believe, in those days, that when you invited guests to a wedding, you would provide them with a garment to wear. So they would be provided with a white garment to wear for the wedding. So if this guy hadn't got his garment on, it meant that he was being insulting. You can't come in here without your proper tunic, your wedding garment. What do you think you're playing at? So that is kind of being used as an analogy for what happens when people want to leave this earth and go to heaven. Now, I think we're probably talking about quite a posh wedding. I don't suppose ordinary people could afford to give wedding garments to everybody who comes along to a wedding, but certainly within the posh, the aristocracy, senatorial class, let's call them, this would be a custom. So why are they saying this, and what are we to understand about the wedding garment? Well, I got some ideas on that, which I want to share with you here. What is this wedding garment? This is explained by Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians. Here he talks about the body of the resurrection, or body of light. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown, physical body, I've put that's my interpolation, is perishable. What is raised, spiritual body, is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a physical body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a physical body, there is also a spiritual body. Thus it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam, again I've interpolated here, Jesus Christ, became a life-giving spirit. But it is not the spiritual which is first, but the physical, then the spiritual. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. The second man is from heaven. As was the man of dust, so are those who are of dust. And as is the man of heaven, so are those who are of heaven. Just as we have been born the image of the man of dust, Adam, we shall also bear the image of the man of heaven, Jesus Christ. I tell you this, brethren, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. So that's in the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, verses 42 to 50. I've been told to make sure I give quotes, so I try to do that now, because I know some of you want to look things up in the Bible and see what else was being said at the same time. But yes, this is what it actually has written in the Bible. So we now need to ask ourselves, well, what is this spiritual or spiritus body? It's quite clear, yeah, dust to dust. So if you want to go to heaven, it says you need a spiritual body. And that's not quite the same thing as your soul, I would say. Just as your soul can live inside your physical body. Now, in an earlier lecture, I pointed out this is like your body is like the car that you're driving. Yeah, you drive the car takes you from A to B, it does things for you. But you are not the car, you are what's driving the car. And when that body dies, doesn't mean that your soul dies with it. But your soul, if it's going to go to heaven, whatever they mean by heaven, it needs an appropriate vehicle to manifest within that situation. And that's what I think this garment is all about. I'm going to say a bit more about that here. So the wedding garment, or white robe, given to a martyr waiting under the altar is the clothing, i.e. astral body, their soul will need in order to enter into the heavenly kingdom. So why is this body needed? Yeah, I should have read the first paragraph out first. The body of the resurrection or body of light is sometimes referred to in esoteric literature as the astral body. You've maybe heard that term. Astral body doesn't mean it's made of the stars. It's the stars themselves are lights. And so it's a body of light. Why do you need it? What is the purpose of that? Well, the answer is quite simple. While on Earth and living inside a physical body of dust, we are able to derive the energy we need from the food we eat and the air we breathe. From this food, our bodies are able to release stored energy and transform it into electricity. I don't know if you realize this, but your body actually runs on electricity. Your life force is electricity. If your charge gets too low, you get sick. And when it gets lower than that is when you die. If you're not been run over by a train or something first. But the body itself, the vehicle, its main purpose is to manufacture energies. And this is what alchemy is all about, or one type of alchemy, is the way that you can take food and air and impressions, and these things will develop together and release higher, subtler energies, which your body can run on. Most of that energy is used up running the body. Some is made available to your brain and your consciousness for you to be able to understand and to think and to appreciate other matters. And if you want to spiritually develop, you need to try and find means of increasing that energy, which is the purpose of things like yoga and other forms of traditional forms of exercise, but more particular spiritual exercises to help you develop more subtle energies to enable you to be able to achieve greater things. But in order to survive the death of the physical body, you need another body. And this seems to be the wedding garment which the martyrs are given as a garment, just as God gave Adam and Eve garments in the book of Genesis. Well, those garments are actually the physical body. That's what it's talking about. The fall wasn't physical initially. That's a whole other story. But the garments that they're given to wear, the garments of skins, are the physical body that we call the human body. And if you're going to leave this earth, you're not going to be able to eat the food of it. This is what I wonder, if people go to Mars, what are they going to eat? What are they going to breathe? There's nothing there of the right type. Our bodies are made for this planet. If you're going to another planet or another star system, you're going to need some other kind of vehicle. And the vehicle that you probably do need is the vehicle of light, which is what's called the astral body. Without a physical body, we cannot do this. That's eat and digest and make electricity from our food. So in order to live in heaven, attending the wedding feast, we need a second body that can live separately from the physical. The astral body, or body of light, is able to feed directly from the breath of God, i.e. the Holy Spirit. Without such a body, we cannot enter heaven. Without it, our souls have no alternative but to quickly reincarnate or face oblivion in outer darkness. So I want to say a few words about that. See, people here tend to be divided into two camps, don't they? There's either the atheists who say, well, eat, drink and be merry, Epicurean style, because you're alive now, you've got a body, and when you die, that's it, you're gone. There's no afterlife. Or there's the optimists who say, well, you know, we're all going to heaven, we just go to church on Sunday, take the sacraments, be good people, and we go to heaven. It doesn't matter, you know, the physical body, that will resurrect anyway. It'll come out of the ground. You know, at the last day of judgment, the angel blow the trumpet, the bodies will come out of the ground, and we'll be lifted up by our hair or something. We'll go to heaven, body and soul all together. Well, I think both of those ideas are wrong. What will exist is your soul, but for your soul to have a conscious existence and for it to be able to do anything, it needs a body. And the body of light is the body that's appropriate for that more subtle area. Turns you into an angelic form, as you might say. The physical body is going to die. And if you haven't got an angelic body and you haven't got a physical body, the best thing your soul can do is to find a reincarnation. And that's probably what we've all been doing for thousands and thousands of years. Yeah, I do believe in this, and I can remember a couple of my previous lives. Many other people can remember more. Other people can't remember anything, because the trouble is, when your soul comes into this life as a baby, it's like you've got total amnesia. Because that previous body, which had a brain with the connections all to all your memories and so on, that's gone. You've got a new brain, new body, new baby, and it's got to reconnect to anything to do with what you knew previously, what you were previously. And meantime, it's like the guy in, have you seen Paris, Texas? The guy can't remember where he's come from, who he is, what he's done, and he's just, you know, like this zombie wandering around trying to work out who he is and what's happened. And so are we, watching it, trying to work it out. And that's kind of how it is. We come into this world with total amnesia. It doesn't matter if you were the Pope last time round and now you're working in the fields, or if you were the Queen of England, yeah, and now you're a railway driver. You know, that's kind of what happens, as I believe. And it's the only way you can think that it could be just, that some people are given all the chances and other people are given a really tough deal. And it's more like a game of cards that, you know, you're dealt out the cards and you might get a wonderful hand with a royal flush in it. Or you might have a hand with just, you know, a few twos and threes and fours, and you can't win any tricks. That's kind of how it is. But anyway, we're not really talking about reincarnation here in the lectures. We're talking about the book of Revelation. So let's press on. So that was the fifth seal, and we've seen how the souls are under the altar, and there really were loads of bodies buried under an altar in that church at the time that this was being written. And now we come to the sixth seal. Yeah, so we've got our manuscripts, and each time one of these first seals is broken, then we are revealed a little bit more. Yeah, so the sixth seal is opened. We got this little bit then to read. the main body of the thing we don't get opened until the seventh seal is opened. So when he opened the sixth seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth. The moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as the fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll that's rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the generals, and the rich, and the strong, and everyone, slave and free, hid in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand before it?" So that's Revelation chapter 6, 12 to 17. So now we're starting to get into the nitty-gritty of the book of Revelation as we would understand it. All these nasty tribulation type things which are going to befall the earth. We're starting to get an intimation of that now with the sixth seal being opened. But is there any other evidence for what this is about and where it's come from? Well, first of all, we get a parallel quote from the Mount of Olives prophecy of Jesus, where he writes, or he said, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all of the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." So that's Matthew 24, verses 29 to 30. So this seems to be a reference given by John in his Revelation to that text from the Mount of Olives discourse of Jesus, which he gave not long before his crucifixion. He's telling his disciples, he's making prophecies, first of all, about the destruction of Jerusalem and about how the people are there and coming, they must flee immediately. Don't go home even for your coat. Get out. Which is true, because the Romans come along and they destroy everything, and everyone is either killed or enslaved, and those who try to hide in Masada down by the Dead Sea, they're put under siege, and eventually most of them commit suicide. It's a terrible time, 70 AD, and the city of Jerusalem is utterly destroyed. So that's part of what that prophecy is about, but it's also about the end of the age. And the end of the age, I believe, is where we are now. And this revelation, I believe, started in the year 2000 with the configuration in the stars around the constellation of Orion. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's all in earlier lecture on opening the Stargate, the gate in heaven. One of these. I've got other lectures to do with opening the Stargate. So there's a parallel prophecy of Jesus. But let's look a little deeper at what's being talked about. The darkening of the sun at the time of a full moon is not understandable as a solar eclipse. The moon turns to blood at the time of a lunar eclipse. When this happens, the sun is on the other side of the sky and below the horizon. No solar eclipse can happen at this time. So understand this, that for a solar eclipse to occur, the moon has to go in front of the sun. And I've actually seen a solar eclipse, the one we had in 1999. I was actually on a ship in the English Channel, and it was clearing the sky just at the right time. Most of England was covered in clouds. People didn't see it, but I was lucky enough to be out on a ship in the Channel, and we saw it with the moon going in front of the sun and the sun blackening out. And I can tell you, it's felt terrifying. You know, even though one knows scientifically what's going on, you know, the movement of these celestial bodies, it makes it so kind of real, the idea that these bodies are in motion and we have absolutely no control over it. This is way beyond us, what is making these bodies move and do whatever they're doing. We can only just respond to it, and it is terrifying. I can understand why ancient peoples would have been terrified of eclipses. But you can't have a lunar eclipse at the same time as a solar eclipse, because for a lunar eclipse to happen, they have to be on either side of the Earth, because it's the Earth's shadow on the moon that makes it look blood red, because a little bit of light creeps around through the atmosphere of the Earth. So the moon's a little bit illuminated, but it's a kind of dull coppery red colour instead of its usual bright colour. Until it comes out of the eclipse, then it goes back to being bright again. So this can't be what's being talked about here. It's not talking about a natural eclipse of the sun, the moon, or indeed anything else. There's something else going on here which is not part of the contemporary view of science as we understand it today, or what you might call mainstream astrophysics. We need to look further. Unfortunately, there is an alternative explanation that I think throws some light on this. So the true explanation for this prophecy is only apparent once it's realized that the sun is not a nuclear bonfire in space. In other words, stars are not driven by atomic power generated from within, though this is what is claimed in virtually all textbooks on the subject. In reality, the nuclear sun model is only a theory pioneered from the 1920s. Now, I wonder if you realise this, because it's kind of not generally talked about, that the whole idea, you know, we're all taught it in school and we see it. Scientists on TV, they all tell us as though they actually know, you know, this is truth, this is our knowledge, that hydrogen compresses inside the sun, a cloud of hydrogen is just there in space, and it kind of gravitation pulls it in, and then it starts a nuclear fusion reaction which makes the hydrogen turn into helium, and this can go on for billions of years in a nice steady state with the sun giving out light and heat to its planets, and spontaneously the Earth just in the right place so that life could evolve here. And what do you know? Here we are. Crazy. It is absolutely crazy. And it's not true. They have not been able to look inside the sun, let alone sort of find out what nuclear reactions are going on inside there. It's just not true. The Victorians worked out how much coal is being burnt on the sun every day to produce the amount of heat that comes out off from it. Because as far as they knew, you know, furnaces burning coal was the hottest thing they understood. It's no different. In the 1920s, they started getting into nuclear physics, and they worked out, yes, there could be these nuclear reactions going on inside the sun that would generate the energy that we see. Einstein's formula, E equals mc squared, you know, that would give it all out. So it must be nuclear energy. The only trouble is that when they actually look at the temperature of a sunspot, you know, the black spots on the sun, which are kind of holes in the surface caused by magnetism, you can look at those holes and you can measure the temperature underneath the surface of the sun, and it's around 4,000 degrees centigrade. Pretty hot. You wouldn't want to go sunbathing there. But when you look at the corona around the outside of the sun, which you see very clearly when there's an eclipse of the sun, and I've seen it myself because I witnessed an eclipse, and there, you know, you see these streams coming out from the sun. The temperature of those are around 2 million degrees centigrade. You've got to think, how could the outside of the sun be hotter than the inside? It doesn't make sense. If the nuclear bomb's in the middle of the sun, how come the outside isn't cooler, where it's more spread out? And of course they come up with all sorts of quasi theories. They don't know, they don't understand, but they pretend they do. And this is something that really annoys me with scientists who will never admit that there's something they don't know. But there are people who do know, and Let's just go back here a sec. There is an alternative electric model. It's that the sun and other stars are analogous to plasma lamps. They receive energy in the form of electrical plasma currents from outside of themselves. They glow because they're in plasma discharge mode. We don't have time to go into discuss this here. The electric universe theory is deserving of a whole series of lectures in its own right. However, here's a brief explanation of it, right? So I want you to understand that there is an alternative theory, and it was starting to be discussed in the early 20th century, but it was squashed when they came up with this nuclear theory, and Einstein was really sexy at the time, you know, Einstein's relativity. If you didn't understand that, you were a nobody. And everything became mathematical modeling. And physics is not really about mathematical modeling. It's about measuring things and working out from the physical, what you see physically, to produce your theories. And I was actually taught this by my physics teacher when I was doing A-level physics at school. He said I could invent a whole physics based on 10 dimensions. He said, but you've got to understand there's actually only 3 dimensions. You can use time, if you like, as a 4th dimension, but that's all we have. That's all there is in the toolbox, if you're talking about physics. And yet, people don't, how do you do experiments to go and create an alternative sun? Yeah, we can't even get a small fusion bomb in a lab. It has not been done. Otherwise, we'd have fusion reactors around the place by now. It's not worked. They've been trying it for decades. They can't make one, not without putting more energy in than they get out, which is not the purpose of the thing, is it? I mean, they can make a fission bomb, like a hydrogen bomb, you know, that blows everything up, but they can't make a controlled fusion reactor, which is what the whole purpose of this research is about. And that's because it's not right. The real answer to the sun and how the sun produces its energy is it comes from outside in the form of electrical currents. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that here. The electric universe model was pioneered around 1900 by a Norwegian scientist, Dr. Christian Birkeland. He demonstrated that the northern lights, that's the aurora borealis to you and I, you know, the northern lights, are the result of electricity entering the Earth's poles. And he was able to model this in the laboratory using his Terrella experiment. Terrella meaning a small Earth. He found that a magnetized steel ball that was bombarded with electrons produced small-scale phenomena similar to aurorae. And here you can see it. On the left, there is the steel ball, and you can see these kind of aurorae coming out from the poles. And it's very similar to the northern lights that we see from space at the poles of the Earth. And I should just add here that we've actually seen aurorae now on other planets like Jupiter and Saturn. And Saturn in particular is really strange because it's got a hexagon at the North Pole. It's clear, a hexagon. Now, you can't explain that in terms of atomic bomb theory or in terms of impact craters or anything like that, but it is very typical of electric discharge events involving plasmas. So there's a plasma discharge event going on the poles of Saturn, and another, you know, at Jupiter, they've seen concentric turning circles at the pole of the clouds moving around at one level that way and then another level that way and then another level that way. This is very typical of what are called Birkeland currents, which flow through space. Now, I'm not going to go into that here. I should probably do another lecture on this at some other time. But what I want you to understand here is that according to the electric universe model, we live in a connected universe, that our sun is connected to energies flowing into it from the galaxy. It in turn sends out energy in terms of electricity, which in this case is plasma. And when plasma is moved, plasma consists of charged particles. They can be electrons, they can be protons, and they exist separately in a charged state. And when they move through space, this causes a current, and when you have a current moving, it creates a magnetic field. And the magnetic field compresses the current, and it turns it into a kind of like an invisible wire. I know this is mind-boggling stuff when you first hear about it, but it results in situations. If the current is quite low, you don't see anything. If it gets stronger, then they go into a glow mode state, like you get in neon lights, neon tubes. And if it gets into a very high state, then you get a plasma discharge event, which gives out bright white light. And that's what happens with stars in the electric universe model. Now, this work was taken up by a Swedish scientist, Nobel laureate no less, called Hans Alfvén. He was a world-renowned expert on the physics of plasmas. He could see what astronomers who have no understanding of this branch of physics could not. This is that the sun, with its complex sunspot cycles, magnetic loops and discharge events, behaves like a gigantic electric anode at the center of a circuit. So you've got to understand that we know quite a bit about electricity, but within contemporary astrophysics, it's ignored. It's extraordinary, but it's ignored. The attitude is that, well, yes, electricity does things on Earth, you know, there's computers running on electricity. We've got lights that are running on electricity. Yeah, it's a big deal. But out in space, it's all gravity, and it's winds, and it's dust clouds, and impact events. That's all we need. And when we can't explain certain phenomena, we invent terms like dark matter, dark energy, black holes, to explain the inexplicable in terms of our gravitational model. But we're not going to part with it because it's our comfort blanket. What they don't appreciate, or if they do, they ignore it, is that the electric force between two particles, right? Let's say we have a proton here and an electron here. Now, you know there's a gravitational attraction because they are particles. The electrical attraction between them is 10 to the 38 times as strong. Right? That's 10 with 38 zeros after it, times as strong attraction, down to electrical force compared with gravity force. So the electrical force, you know, gravity is irrelevant when you have wide-scale electric forces involved. And they're what are actually forming the universe into the shape it is, creating galaxies, suns, planets. It goes right through, and everything's connected. Our sun, our Earth, the other planets, they're not islands in space. They're not just these rocks floating around, vaguely held by gravity around the sun, but not really doing anything. They are connected by plasma currents flowing from one to the other. Everything is connected. And this is the great insight of people like Hans Alfvén, who was a plasma scientist. He actually was one of the people that pioneered the development of sending currents down large cables, I suppose you call them, on pylons. And when you open and close the switches on those, they give you great arcs of current flowing. Very dangerous, actually. And he was one of the people that was working on that and developing the theories concerning that. People like him and Tesla, who you've probably heard of as well. Unfortunately for him, and for physics in general, the field was by then, in the 1960s and 70s, dominated by mathematicians and their hypothetical models based on nothing more than equations. These could not be tested in the laboratory, so the field was left open to wild speculation about dark matter, dark energy, black holes, gravitational waves, and the like. That is still the case today. Alfvén, as I was saying, he worked out the sun acts like an anode. An anode is a positively charged body in regard to a cathode, which is negatively charged, and you will get flow in a vacuum. You'll get flow of electrons through the vacuum from the cathode to the anode. That's how old-fashioned valves in old-fashioned radios and televisions used to work. We don't have those now. We have transistors. Interestingly, Dr. Donald Scott, who was a friend of mine, he's actually stayed in my house. He's a great guy, fantastic man. He has pioneered and taken on Alfvén's work, and with the Thunderbolts group. And if you've got time, look into thunderbolts.info. They've got a website called thunderbolts.info, which goes into a lot of this material. But anyway, he's taken the Alfvén model further, and he's worked out, demonstrated how the sun acts like a giant transistor in the way it controls the flow of electrical current from itself, but has also elaborated on Christian Birkeland's work concerning current flows throughout space. This is the direction we need to be looking if we are to understand the prophecy for the sun suddenly darkening. So let's return to our text. When he opened the sixth seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth. The full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to earth, as a fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll that is rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. So what's all this about? Well, if you understand that there's an electric current flow going to the sun from the galaxy, should anything switch that current off, the sun is going to suddenly darken. It's just the same as switching off a light, isn't it? In fact, under the electric universe theory, as opposed to the contemporary astrophysics mainstream theory, stars have their particular colours depending not on their distance or the speed of movement, Doppler effect, whatever you want to call it, redshift, but on the amount of current that is flowing through them. So if the current is low, the star glows in a red colour. Hence you get these red giants. If you crank up the current, it will go to the yellow like our sun. Crank it up further, it will go into being a white star. I mean, this is totally heretical as far as normal everyday astrophysics is concerned, but this is what the electric model predicts. So if you turn off the current to the sun, it's going to go into dark mode. Hence the sun will go darken. And the moon receives its light from the sun as well. It also gets some from the earth, where the sunlight is channeled around the earth through the atmosphere, which is why it stays a red colour even during a lunar eclipse when it's behind the earth. But switch off the big lights in the sky, the sun, and everything's going to go dark. And it's going to cause other effects. You sudden change like this could easily make the earth shake and you would get an earthquake. And the idea of the stars falling out of the sky, well, there's an awful lot of stuff up there. This is a meteorite, which someone very kindly sent to me for my birthday present. Now imagine a load of these coming down on Earth. If one of these came down and hit you, you're not only dead, you're splattered. So you could imagine there could be a comet or asteroid or something shedding material like this into the Earth's atmosphere, and there would be a rain down of these. This has happened before. You get meteorite showers and impacting on the ground. Be like shaking a fig tree. The fig tree always has small fruits on it right through the year, but some of those are not going to ripen. And shake the fig tree. It's like we do with apple trees in this country in June. You get the June fall of unripened apples when there's a strong wind blowing. You shake the tree, and some of those apples will fall down. And it's actually a good thing because you don't want too many on the tree anyway, fruits. So that's the kind of analogy it's talking about. But it could be something else as well. There's an awful lot of satellites up there that we've put up there. Um, at the moment, SpaceX is putting up thousands of satellites for running Wi-Fi, and they call it Starlink. So imagine all these satellites up there, and suddenly all this is happening, and it might affect the gravitational field of the Earth as well, and could destabilize these in their orbits and cause loads of these and other space debris to come raining down. I don't know, but this is something that could actually happen. So, and then we have to wonder about this scroll rolling up. Well, imagine if the heavens, the stars move round us very gradually. They move by 1 degree every 4 minutes. You can't see the movement, but you can measure it. It's too slow to actually observe it directly. But imagine if the Earth, and we know that that's actually caused by the Earth's rotation. It's not the stars rotating around us. It's our Earth rotating on its axis. But imagine if that rotation was suddenly speeded up or reversed, going around the other way. Suddenly we see the stars in the heavens going around us super fast. And that would be like rolling up a scroll. That's the description that John is giving us here. Probably the best thing he could come up with, because he didn't know about the Earth rotating. It wasn't in the physics of the time. But he would understand about the heavens going round and spinning and it going round like a scroll being rolled up. And the sky vanished like a scroll was rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Well, if you started moving the Earth around like that, that's going to cause tsunamis, it's going to cause earthquakes, it's going to cause mountains to go up and down, all sorts of, terrifying events. And this is kind of what is being sort of prophesied here. So, if the electric sun model is the true reality of what is powering the solar system, then it becomes possible to think of what would happen if the current was reduced, or indeed switched off altogether. In the latter case, you might indeed see both the sun going dark and the full moon going blood red for a lack of light from the sun. And then stars falling to Earth sounds like a description of a meteorite storm. This could either be because a comet or asteroid passes nearby and sheds material, or perhaps we should be thinking of all the satellites we currently have orbiting the Earth. What if the sudden darkening of the sun caused an immediate reversal of the Earth's magnetic field, or even changed its gravity? Might this destabilize the orbits of satellites and cause them to come crashing back down again? As for the sky rolling up like a scroll, this suggests the appearance of the sky suddenly rotating very fast around the Earth. Of course, it would really be the Earth that was changing its rate of spin, perhaps in a violent, chaotic way. This would be absolutely terrifying. For one thing, it would cause colossal winds, stronger than any hurricane. To avoid these, people would seek shelter underground or in caves. The movement of mountains and islands suggests the earth changes of the kind experienced by Atlantis, with the rising and lowering of tectonic plates. This would, of course, be accompanied by earthquakes of huge magnitude. And it goes on. Then the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the generals, and the rich, and the strong, and everyone, slave and free, hid in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, "Fall on us, and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand before it?" So that's the end of chapter 6, and it leaves us in this situation of a prophecy for earth changes of enormous consequence, which, if you think in terms of ordinary astronomy, such as we observe occasional eclipse, makes no sense at all. But when you begin to understand that we live in a planet, in a solar system. And the solar system is one of many stars. They all have systems of one sort or another. Very likely, many of them have got a planet, similar to Earth with people on it of some sort. Very likely. This one has been a rebel planet for a long time, and things are going to be cleaned up here. And in the process of that, there are going to be Earth changes, and it's going to be quite terrifying for us, I think. And I think we are in the generation, or certainly within the next generation or two, that are going to witness these events. I think sooner rather than later myself. So I'm going to leave you with that. This is the end of chapter 6. We'll go into chapter 7 in the next lecture, and we're going to then be talking about the sons of Israel and the marking of the sons of Israel, 144,000, what that's really all about, and what that has to do with not so much the state of Israel as we know it today, but something else, which I shall explain to you in the next lecture. So thank you. If you haven't already subscribed, please do. You're going to help me if you can do that, because I need to get the numbers of subscribers up so that YouTube will start offering this channel to other people. When you go on YouTube, it says, have a look at this, have a look at that, when you've been watching something else. And they do that more. The more people who watch a particular channel, the more that channel is recommended to other people. So it will really help me to get the word out if you will subscribe and like the video and click the little bell symbol as well, which means you'll be notified when another of these lectures is put up. So thank you very much for your time and your patience. Look forward to speaking again. Goodbye.